Recording. So
Great.
great. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and begin. This is a slide you've seen many times, but we're happy to share that final update that the legislature adjourned sine die, or Latin without a date certain, on Friday, March 6th at 4:17 p.m. The legislature got through all of their work ahead of the constitutional deadline of 30 days. And certainly a lot of things happened in the session. Just to take that rear view look, there were just 33 days, but 304 measures considered with 599 amendments. For context, that's about a quarter of the amendments that the legislature processed during the last long session, which is nearly 6 months versus those 33 days. So certainly a lot of very quick work happening. Of the 304 measures introduced, 104 bills passed. And we'll talk through some of those bills, and I'll talk more about this later, but we'll also include more in the session summary report that will be released in April. We've made progress on LOC priorities, as you'll hear throughout. Look for the bolded call out of LOC priority to understand where we've been able to move the needle on priorities we set in early 2025. And we're also also what happened in the session was a lot of groundwork laid for 2027, conversations around transportation, revenue, technology needs, and more. We did get a good forecast of some of the conversations we'll be having next year in Salem. But to give you just some summary recaps, we talked through the budget summary last time in terms of what the changes were. We just wanted to start with taking a look back. What were the reductions that occurred? As you may recall, the legislature entered the session with around $370 million deficit across state agencies, an additional $288 million deficit just for ODOT due to the referral of the transportation package. For each of these deficits, there were a few key strategies taken. First and foremost were the strategies that the legislature did not have control over. The first one being agency clarity around the implementation requirements of HR 1 helped address some of that deficit. That deficit was also addressed by an increase in the revenue forecast, as state economists feel that the possibility of recession is smaller than it was from their previous forecast. So there was a additional revenue because of that assumption. In addition, the legislature chose to disconnect from some provisions of the federal tax code. We talked about this in other webinars, and we'll talk about this more when we get to the revenue section. And lastly, there were around $130 million of agency reductions. This mostly looked like the elimination or holding positions vacant in agencies, not layoffs, but vacant positions being held. And in addition, a number of services and supply budgets were cut. For ODOT, the reductions look a little different. Their challenge was frankly of a much greater scale. They also had agency reductions. They were eliminating positions, holding some vacant, but there were no layoffs at ODOT as previously feared. And ODOT is now able to rehire some of the key positions they've been holding vacant at DMVs and at maintenance stations. In addition, there's also redirection of funds. So federal grant funds, unencumbering statutory funds was another part of this strategy. And in addition, capital projects were paused or canceled to redirect those funds into operations and maintenance. And the biggest impact that matters most to cities is a number of grant programs have been paused. Some of the funds have been swept completely, but there are some programs where funds remain. Actually, just 2 programs where key funds remain. Safe Routes to School will have an offering in 2027 of remaining biennial funds. And Connect Oregon also has some funds remaining that will, my understanding is, support existing awarded projects. So no projects will be canceled. They might have enough for another run. We haven't heard that confirmation quite yet from ODOT. So that's a lot of challenging cuts, certainly for the agencies, but the scale of which was much less dramatic than what we anticipated coming into the session, and frankly, much less dramatic than what legislative budget authors were forecasting. The legislative budget officers had been saying, 6 days after they created this biennial budget, they started working on this reduction package with a variety of scale. So they knew there'd be some level of reduction. The $750 million figure that they forecast at the beginning of session was actually a bit lower than the $900 million figure they were planning planning for. So they had a scale of reduction options heading into the legislative session. We think what they've taken has been really modest. We expected much more dramatic cuts. And I will look into the crystal ball now and say we are likely to see more dramatic cuts in 2027 unless there are different revenue conversations happening at the legislature. But even though there were dramatic cuts, there were also a few budget adds. So I wanted to just highlight these for you. This is a summary, a little bit higher level than what you saw last week, focused just on the matters that impact cities. So it's an additional $10 million for the regional infrastructure funds, wildfire resources, as well as industrial site loan fund resources. And on the bonding side, the Moda Center capital development was a huge priority for the city of Portland, and we saw 14 cities see their projects funded through lottery bonds. So despite the decrease in lottery revenue, the legislature was able to allocate additional lottery bonds. And we'll now shift from budget to policy. So before we do, I'm just going to pause and see if there's any questions in the Q&A. I'm not seeing any, but if folks have them, I have that up and can answer them along the way. But we'll go ahead and shift over to transportation. There are really just 3 bills related to transportation that passed this session. House Bill 4007, we've talked about quite a bit. This regulates micro-mobility devices. It creates a state framework and definitions for these devices, and permits jurisdictions, local governments to create time, place, manner regulations or outright prohibit micromobility devices. So it's an important bill to be watching in our April legislative session summary. It'll include more information about the implementation timeline and effective dates of these bills. So I encourage you to look out for that. In addition, in the transportation space, Senate Bill 1544 was the Senate Transportation's omnibus bill and included multiple provisions, including expanding eligibility for who can receive transit funding, and modifying dismantler requirements and how local governments engage. So this bill, the amendments were adopted fairly late in the session and moved through the process really rapidly. And the last bill is likely one you've heard quite a bit about. It's received a lot of news coverage. Senate Bill 1599 moves the date of the transportation tax referendum from November to May. There have been legal challenges back and forth, but earlier this week, a judge ruled that the legislature did have authority to move the date forward. And I'll pause there. There's a question here from ODOT. The question is related to ODOT's Community Path Grants program. My understanding is if you have received any awarded funds, those funds are still flowing through. If you are in the process or considering going out for additional funds, they might not be available. I'll go ahead and respond to this question in writing with my email and just encourage you, if you have specific questions, I'm happy to follow up and work with ODOT to get those answered. All right, I'm not seeing any other transportation questions. I'm going to move us forward to talk a little bit more about the revenue and finance bills. I'll talk just about the federal disconnect package and then invite in Scott to cover the other bills on this. Actually, I'll talk about the first 2 bills and then invite in Scott to talk about the other bills. The first bill here is that federal disconnect package. Oregon has a long history of connecting and disconnecting from the federal tax code rather. In this case, some of the key disconnections were related to, some of the key definitions that could have happened. The legislature did talk about the federal disconnect package as it relates to taxes on overtime and tips. That is not what they moved forward with. Overtime and tips will no longer be taxed in the state of Oregon. They did disconnect from the vehicle loan interest deduction, as well as the qualified small business stock deduction and the bonus depreciation disconnect. The bill also created some key investments in tax credits. The first one being actually an expansion of Oregon's earned income tax credit, and the second being a new tax credit for taxpayers creating jobs. So this certainly was a controversial bill in the legislative session, and the specific details of what was included in that will be in our session summary report with additional information about how that revenue might impact you. And then the second bill, House Bill 4178, created a rounding policy. So you may be tracking the US Treasury will no longer be minting pennies, and we're seeing a penny shortage. This was a bill brought forward by the grocers who are having challenges being able to give appropriate change to their customers. Many cities have rounding policies, and this bill allows cities to maintain their rounding policies, but includes some requirements about noticing and posting those policies. So we want to make sure you're tracking that. And then in addition, we have what was an LOC priority bill that passed. So I will turn things over to Scott to give us the rundown of where that bill landed and the work it took to get it through.
Good afternoon, everybody. So we have some great news. We did get the House Bill 4148 out of the chamber this time. This session, it is on its way to the governor's desk. We came out of it with some pretty comfortable margins. A little different than where we were in the long session. The bill that comes out will allow a city that has, or a county, that imposed the transient lodging tax on or after 2003 to use half of that revenue for services. The other half would go to tourism promotion. Under the current rubric, it's a 70-30 split, with 70% going to tourism and 30% going to meeting the needs of the community. So this was a major team effort. I want to give a tremendous amount of credit to Senator Weber, who is leaving the legislature. I will miss her dearly. She was a definite friend of the league. Representative Walters, Representative Javity, Representative Nathanson, our friends at AOC, our police chiefs, our fire chiefs. This was a all hands on deck effort to get this bill out, and we did it. So really speaks well for our grassroots efforts. I think some of you were aware of some complications, if you will, during the hearing, and our dear friends from Lincoln County were able to reach out to their senator, and I think he did see the find his way to a more helpful path. So appreciate that. So we will see. The bill does have some reporting requirements that weren't there before. It does place an obligation on the league to collect some of this data. You can look forward to some webinars and some additional information as to how that's going to be accomplished. It also places, and I think this is really important, it also places reporting requirements on the recipients of that tourism promotion tax, so that people can know how those are still public dollars, even though they're going to, in some cases, private or nonprofit entities, and the public should know how those are spent. And so they'll have some reporting requirements as well. There is a provision in the bill that did cause some controversy that allows a local government to use part of the 50% that's dedicated towards tourism promotion to provide resiliency grants to restaurants and hotels. Resiliency is not defined in the bill, so we have to fall back on that Webster's definition. And so it really is an area where the business is in a existential threat that they're not going to be able to continue due to an external factor, some trauma, some significant difficulty. It can't just be like a normal business cycle. The travel industry, the hospitality industry, the travel folks, they're very concerned about this provision because it would reduce the amount that would be going into tourism promotion. And so we do encourage folks to collaborate to issue these grants when absolutely necessary and in collaboration with your tourism industry, but look forward to some additional information and some class webinars and probably a conference session somewhere down the road. The bill does take effect on January 1st, 2027. So we do have some time to develop those materials, but really, it was really an honor to work on this bill. It was great to have a fully functional coalition and legislators who really saw the need to move this bill forward. And I'll say that the final vote was bipartisan, so it was really good to see that everybody came together to support cities.
Thanks, Scott. And thanks for folks that might not know this. Scott jumped in on this bill and supported it with a vacancy and just did a great job getting it over the finish line. And Scott, we have one question for you from a member. what is the percentage that can go to the resiliency grant? So of the 50% for tourism, is there a designated percentage for those grants?
There is not a designated percentage for those grants. And I think that was one of the points of concern among the hospitality industry, is that conceivably, I don't see this happening in practical terms. Conceivably, a local government could spend that money on grants and not engage in tourism promotion. I think we do have to look at that word resiliency and what it means. As you know, Oregon is a pretty strict constructional state, so the definition, the meaning of that word is pretty clear, that it's for a business that has suffered a traumatic event that's outside of their control, that it's outside of the normal course of business difficulties. So again, we definitely encourage people to use those funds sparingly and in collaboration with their hospitality industry.
Thank you, Scott. I think we're still on you for a couple more slides, so I will go ahead and move us forward. I'm not seeing any additional
Okay,
questions.
great. Okay. So 4138, this bill did pass. It was significantly amended from where it started. What the bill requires is that for a law enforcement officer operating in the state of Oregon, in part of their normal day-to-day duties, they would not be able to obscure their identity with a mask. They would also have to wear a uniform that has a name or some other individual identifier, and their uniform would also have to make it very clear that they are in fact a police officer and which agency they work for. This bill should not have any practical impacts on Oregon local or state law enforcement. Masking in the normal course of duties is not something that is done by our agencies. The bill does allow officers to wear masks if they need to if there's an OSHA issue and you're in a poor air quality day and you're required to provide N95 respirators, or if they're for weather, for other OSHA reasons to protect their health and safety. There's a limited exemption for undercover operations. That's pretty rare, but it is in the bill. So this should not impact day-to-day operations. The bill, because of a federal court ruling out of California, the theory and the belief is that the bill would apply, since it's applying to all law enforcement officers, that it could apply to federal agents operating in the state of Oregon. And so the practice of obscuring one's identity and to engage in law enforcement, your normal duties would not be allowed of a federal agency either. There's some enforcement through the courts on the bill. So that bill did pass. It's in the bill. We'll have a bill summary on it, and the chiefs and sheriffs are also going to be issuing their guidance there. 1516. This bill was an interesting thing to lobby. What the bill will do is it does. First off, 1516 it's an omnibus bill, so it deals with a few things, but of particular interest to cities is the regulation of ALPRs, so automatic license plate readers. This is a technology that allows an officer to, on their patrol car, they're driving around, the technology will look at the license plate, and if somebody has a warrant, they're felony suspended, it's a silver or amber alert, it would alert that officer that's they need to have some attention to that car for a very clear public safety reason. So what the bill does is it limits our ability to retain that data to 30 days. It also makes clear that we're limiting the data sharing, so we're only dealing with sharing that data for events that are crimes within the state of Oregon. So if there's a kidnapping case out of Idaho, and Idaho says they think the person fled to Oregon, then that's going to go on a hot list, what's called a hot list, and that officers would flag that if they encounter that license plate, because kidnapping people is illegal everywhere that I'm aware of. Um, if it's an administrative immigration warrant, that's not gonna fly. That is not something that Oregon enforces. If it's a judicial warrant where there's actually a federal crime, that's a different matter. But for um, mass requests for license plate data for that purpose, that would not be allowed. It probably wasn't. I'm not sure it would have been allowed under the current state of the law. The bill also creates a public safety or a public records exemption for this data. So requests a public records request for license plate data. Currently, there's actually quite a bit of vulnerability for this data. And while it is public record, it could be used for some fairly nefarious purposes. So we've made it so that the request has to be narrowly tailored and there has to be a public interest exemption. And so the concern we have is, there's a lot of talk about immigration and ICE enforcement and CPB enforcement, but a person who is looking for someone that they're not allowed to contact for, say, a domestic violence assault reason, could also make a public records request for that data. And so we felt it was really important to shield that data from mass release. And so with that piece in there, it was interesting that it was so difficult to get this bill through. I think there were some parties who wanted more and were willing to oppose the bill without, I think, fully understanding the vulnerability of some of the information that we would have to release. And then we also have House Bill 4099, and that creates a task force on responding to veterans in crisis, and we will be appointing a city representative there. So that will probably be someone from one of our public safety agencies who is trained in crisis intervention and is in a leadership role. So I'll pause there for questions.
Yeah, so there are a quick question on the automatic license plate reader bill. The question, are private corporations still allowed to collect and share the data from and share license plate data collected on their property? So could private corporations collect and share that data?
So private companies, so most large big box stores do use these items to ensure that a person is if someone has been trespassed from their property or to identify, say, organized retail theft, to flag those license plates. They own that data. And so I've never heard of a private entity sharing that information. And I'm not sure that the way this data is collected, it would be particularly useful. So it wouldn't be particularly, I don't know that it would be predictive of somebody's movements. And so I've never heard of it being done. I think, they own their data. And the bill didn't really address what a private entity does with information that's collected on their property. So I'll go peruse the other questions, see if there's other questions.
We've got one question in the chat about employment law and a number of bills. So we'll probably answer that one in writing. Scott, we'll go ahead and move to your next slide, which includes, I believe, if I'm correct, it includes one of the bills mentioned there. So
I believe it does. Ahead. Okay, so we did get the ethics bills passed out of the session, this package. Not without some controversy that continues, but I'll go through those. I'll go 4177 last. So 4161 has passed. It is on its way to the governor's desk, and it passed overwhelmingly out of both chambers. And this bill will allow public officials, and we say public officials in an OGEC context, we're talking about elected officials, we're talking about employees, volunteers, and some contractors. So the bill also allows a public official to accept $100 in merchandise from the agency they serve. So if you're giving somebody a branded water bottle, a plaque, those sorts of things, that's no longer a challenge. The OGEC ruled that wouldn't be, it's not a gift; it would be a prohibited use of office. We disagreed. We tried to get them to see reason, and they didn't, and we had to run a bill that passed overwhelmingly. So that's where we are at 4159. That will require one of the OGEC commissioners to have local government experience. What we had noticed is that when we have particularly a strong city attorney on serving on the OGEC, we don't have to run a lot of ethics bills. And so our plan would be to consult with the appointing entities, which are the legislative caucuses plus the governor, to coordinate on a local government designee, preferably. It'll probably be a city attorney. I know there are a number of people in the membership who have expressed interest in serving. However, if you have to file any sort of reporting, so your SEI filings, or a lobbyist filing, you're not eligible to serve. So it has to be someone who's not an SEI filer. That's in the statute. So, but we will be looking forward to recruiting a strong representative in the very near future. 4177. It does a bunch of stuff, but primarily this is the serial meeting fix bill. Yeah, I mean, I've read the editorials. We're writing a response to one of them. There were a lot of people who I used to think knew something about the open meetings law, and turns out not so much. The bill isn't a particularly drastic departure from the current state of the law. Fact-finding conversations have always been allowed. What was prohibited was the act of deliberation and deciding, and that's what the court ruled in the Handy decision, and that's what the law has reflected since 1974 or 75 when it went into effect. So all the bill does was pretty much restate the rubric we were operating under the Handy decision, which I think everybody here has probably been trained on. So there has been some requests from the media interests to veto this bill. I find that disappointing. The media representatives who were part of the group that brought the bill forward elected not to show up to some meetings. They were originally neutral on this language that was apparently so awful, and then at the last minute said, about that, we're actually opposed, and tried to kill the whole package, and that didn't fly. So we're going to talk about this again in 2020 for the 2027 session. They're welcome to attend. They're welcome to participate, and we hope everybody shows up in good faith, and we can have a constructive conversation. But you will be seeing more information on this bill in the bill summary, and it's going to be we'll have some updated training to reflect the statute changes. It will take effect 90 days after sine die, so June-ish, I think. So that's where we're at.
Thanks, Scott. I don't see any questions on this. I know this has been an issue our members have been unfortunately tracking way too closely. Right. I'm still not seeing any questions, so we'll head to general government updates from Greg.
Thanks, Nicole. Good afternoon, Greg Miller, league lobbyist. Focus areas are on energy and telecom issues. This session, we had the opportunity to work on House Bill 4016 throughout the duration of the session. It was one of the first bills that we monitored seeking some clarification from the committee as to whether or not the intent was to apply as broadly as it did, including cities, counties, political subdivisions of the state. In the committee hearing, it was clarified that we were not to be included in this, and that the idea was that it was to apply to state contracts only. So this is one of those bills that passed that really does nothing for cities, but in a good way, in that we were amended out of it and no longer have to do the Department of Revenue's work in ensuring tax compliance for companies that we hire to do public works at cities. 1517 is a recreational liability waiver bill that passed this session. Coming into February, there were two competing bills. Senate Bill 1593 was the rec industry supported version to revalidate liability waivers in Oregon. The trial lawyers and some Senate leaders deemed that bill too broad in its application. And so after moving it to the Senate Rules Committee, that bill died there in session. Senate Bill 1517 was moved to the House, amended in the Senate, to include a broader scope in terms of allowing recreational waivers outside of just the skiing industry. I'll go take a step back and say 1517 was originally introduced very limited to help ski resorts with their liability waiver issue. So through some compromise towards the duration of the session again, the couple nights before the end of session, there was some negotiation directed by the governor's office to House and Senate leaders on this bill to get something done that's a compromise. So after the bill technically kind of died in the House Rules Committee, it was revived that afternoon and a compromise was reached. And again, half a loaf in this conversation is a win in that recreational liability waivers have been revalidated. There are some carve-outs and exemptions in the bill that I would encourage you to review with your city attorney or counsel, in that issues around vehicle maintenance, using vehicles to transport people, and also personnel safety training are two issues that you're really going to want to look at in how you use liability waivers in your cities. The next bill, House Bill 4089, this bill absolutely did include a very broad group of entities that would have been suffering from really, really significant increased penalties as defined by wage theft laws. In talking with the proponents of the bill, we learned that it is really focused on the contracting industry and the fact that in some instances, general contractors are using unlicensed subcontractors, or they're using a quote unquote rented CCB construction contractor's license from somebody else to get a job. So the league with some other cities worked with the proponent of the bill to make sure that it was really focused on commercial contracting, not widely applied to impact cities too. That would have been a pretty difficult one for us to weather had it not been amended. So of all three of these bills, just have to compliment everybody that helped from different cities to different staff. The amendments that we were able to get and crafted from your subject matter experts were key in getting the amendments that we needed. Next slide, please. These two bills deal with pretty much the same thing, so I'm going to talk about them kind of together. House Bill 4031 and 4076A were both introduced with the intent of getting ahead of expiring federal tax credits for renewable energy products or projects. House Bill 4031 specifically exempts large renewable energy projects, which there's I would say a large handful, maybe between, I think the numbers I heard were between 6 and 12 across the state, exempts them from the EFSC, the Energy Facility Siting Council process to obtain the certificate to build. The reason for this is when the EFSC process was established, the types of projects we were considering were based on fossil fuels. They were based on nuclear energy, coal, inputs that we really wanted to have some serious conversation and review over. Renewables, obviously not fossil fuels, obviously not nuclear, are being deemed as projects that we could cite a lot faster than those projects. So 4031 creates an exemption for projects that meet certain conditions from the FSEC process, and it would defer to the county permitting process for these projects. The FSEC assumption is to have a permit applied or a certificate to a developer within 24 months. But in some cases, the industry is saying that can take up to 24 months to 48 months. And so the idea here is to really speed up the siting of some of these projects. House Bill 4670 or 4076, like I mentioned, was kind of in the same vein as 4031. This applies to projects that currently have an FSEC certificate, but they're not meeting their transmission capacity for that project. This allows an addendum to that FSEC certificate to allow additional renewable projects to be constructed under definitely tight circumstances to supplement the transmission capacity and maximize the infrastructure that is put into place. It does contain a small local government preemption related to permitting on EFU land, exclusive farm use land. But that's the kind of the same tenor that the FSEC is looking at this. It really just expedites these projects in terms of not applying all of the state's land use goals to these. I don't think I have another slide. I'd be happy to answer any questions, but I believe that's that.
Thanks, Greg. I'm not seeing any questions. We'll do the normal pause here. All right. Well, folks, think of questions. Feel free to put those in the chat. Our next series of updates will be from Alexandra Ring on housing, land use, and economic development.
Hey folks, for those I've not met previously, my name is Alexandra Ring. I'm the Housing and Land Use Lobbyist for League of Oregon Cities, and I've also been helping cover ACTEV this session. We'll go through things super quick. I think this group has heard from me a lot on a lot of these bills. Many of them passed very early in session, but I'll continue to go through them. So the first up is going to be HB 4037. This was this session's omnibus housing bill. And it really is quite a selection of different items. It has changes to the middle income revolving loan program to allow cities a bit more flexibility in terms of how they pay back those loans, exactly how that program works. It has some additional changes related to community development financial institutions that are a little bit less relevant to our folks. It makes some kind of technical fixes around some of the LCDC enforcement orders that they can do against local governments. There were originally more provisions regarding new enforcement orders against local governments. Those were removed in the dash 10 of the bill. I have to get my amendment numbers right, but they did not make it into the final bill. There are some changes to building plan review for 1 and 2 family dwellings of conventional light frame construction, getting really niche here in our bills. And then additionally, kind of most relevant to a lot of our jurisdictions is Section 17, which is around the review of housing applications, and specifically in what circumstances cities can provide notices and host public hearings on housing applications that meet clear and objective standards. Additionally, there are some other provisions related to disaster impacted tenancies. These are all really continued cleanups from the 2020 wildfires and lessons learned. So additionally, I will include there were some kind of amendments at the 11th hour. It kind of seemed like this one was not going to pass as a consequence. By changes to allow cities to more easily establish urban reserves and what cities can consider when creating an urban reserve study area. Cities can now look at built constraints to make it a little bit easier to determine what is going to be good buildable land for housing in the future. And then additionally, some changes regarding residential development on commercial land. A number of you may have been following the Senate Bill 8 conversations a couple years ago that changed where affordable housing could be constructed by right. That's creating some issues in cities that have expansion areas where they're now not having commercial development. Since we want to create complete communities, just some updates to that area to make it a little bit easier for our jurisdictions. So it's a mixed bag for our cities, depending on your jurisdiction. You may love this bill, you may hate this bill. It's just a really mixed bag. HB 4035 and HB 4082 are very similar bills. They regard the one-time UGB expansion program that is originally from SB 1537 back in the 2024 session. 4035 just kind of more broadly updates the terms of the program, makes it a little bit easier for cities to actually use. So originally it said that you had to be severely cost burdened or have severely rent burdened residents. Now it's reduced that out down to just cost burdened. And there's a percentage put by that to ensure that we're giving this tool to communities that really need it. It expands the number of acres that a large city can bring in and a number of other little provisions to make it easier for cities to use. For those of you surrounded by resource land, you can now use this tool if you are more than 80%, and there's a whole calculation formula. Have a conversation with DLCD to use that tool. LOC will be hosting a webinar in conjunction with DLCD about accessing this tool, probably in April, so keep an eye out for that. 4082 makes changes to the same tool to allow a new portion that can just be used for manufactured homes and senior housing that remove some of those initial qualification criteria to try to encourage these housing types. But it does not make it so that you could only build these housing types. And then last but not least is Governor Kotek's Prosperity Roadmap package. This was one of two major economic development bills that we saw this session. This was the only one that passed. The final bill, looks very similar to its kind of initial format with some key changes. So it includes that the permitting task force, so making it easier to get some large-scale development permits for economic development through state permitting, not local permitting. That's the key. So DEQ, OWRD, all those kinds of things. They have to meet certain criteria, but that's in there. You have changes to how the initial criteria that cities are allowed to use to set up E-zones, enterprise zones, some new criteria for the metrics. And then you do have one thing, which is that's a little bit more controversial. The extension of E-zones. Cities now have the option to extend E-zones. It is very clear now in the final version of the bill. Spent a lot of time working on that it is a city option and not a agency option. That's not in the hands of Biz Oregon. So if your city wants to extend an E-zone, you can, provided that the businesses in that E-zone are meeting the criteria. And then additionally, there is a provision that for certain types of E-zones, and I think this has been something that there's been a lot of confusion on, and I will not say that I am an expert on this, that data centers and cryptocurrency mining operations are not permitted in certain kinds of E-zones until the end of next legislative session. So really what they're trying to do is give the legislature time, the governor's working group on data centers time to come back with some recommendations about really how to tailor data center regulations in Oregon to meet Oregonians' needs. There was originally contemplation of a wholesale ban of data centers and cryptocurrency mining operations in E-zones. That did not make it through, but we do have this provision. So we'll see. This will be a continuing conversation that will come up next session. I know that they are having the governor's work group on data centers is having a meeting this month on water usage, and then next month they'll be talking more about the impact on kind of our land use system. I know a number of folks in kind of city land are part of that conversation. We'll continue to bring that to folks as those conversations evolve. And I'll hand it back over to my colleagues, unless there's questions.
Thanks, Alexandra. Just one question came through. So the question it seems that only regular E zones, not long-term rural enterprise zones or strategic investment plans. That's where the data center ban would apply to. Am I
Yes.
correct in interpreting that correction? Great.
Yes, it does seem that it only applies to the kind of regular E-zone, standard E-zone, whatever you want to call that. I think there is some confusion as to whether or not they meant it to apply to all of them and drafted the bill wrong, or whether or not that was an intentional oversight, but it does not seem to apply to the long-term rural enterprise zones or the SIPs.
Thanks, Alexander. Both that question and your response are evident of how fast and furious the legislature was moving in those final moments. I'm not seeing any additional questions come through. We just have one more bill area to report out on, and I'll invite in Michael Martin. Here you are, Michael.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Nicole. I'm Michael Martin. I cover the water, wastewater, natural resources, and solid waste portfolio. And it was a short session, so I have a short update for you. House Bill 4005 established a Water Professionals Appreciation Week. This came out of our operator and training priority. Heading into session, there was a lot of comments about how the budget was going to be very bad. I think Nicole did a fantastic job covering how it wasn't as bad as they sort of anticipated. But what came out of the conversation of operator and training was establishing a Water Professional Appreciation Week to help continue to remind the legislature that the men and women who do these jobs, drinking water, wastewater operators, on behalf of all our cities, that work is needed, and there's going to be a lot of folks retiring over the years. So this is really an opportunity to have conversations with your legislator about it. So excited, and this sailed through the legislature. The second bill was grant matching. That's Senate Bill 1585. And I think it's best to start this out with a quote from the House Majority Leader, Representative Bowman, who said, "I will publicly say that the persistence of these legislators," that's Senator Manning and Representative Deal, and his vice chair, Representative Elmer, has been impressive to watch. And I just want to say, I've heard this often, but you do nothing alone in this business. And so in this work, and so many of you endured many requests to reach out to your legislators. And that is what I think made the difference. This was, in fact, the last policy bill that the House passed. So we didn't know if it would make it, and we got a text, Nicole and I got a text the night before. Oh, it's going, it's moving. So thank you everybody for your advocacy. The Small Municipalities Advocacy Coalition, who originally brought the idea in the long session, and just so many others who helped get this bill over the finish line. And simply what it does is that it lowers grant match for 7 grants on a sliding scale based on population. 3 are with ODOT, 1 is with Business Oregon, and 2 are with the Water Resources Department, and then there's a Parks Department one as well. So last but not least, battery producer responsibility. Effectively, what this does, it will require a producer responsibility organization to submit an implementation plan to DEQ no later than 2028, so we can safely dispose of batteries, and it requires the battery producer responsibility program to be operational by June 2029. So if there's more specific questions about that, happy to answer them. But that's the update I have for you.
Thank you, Michael. I'm pausing, but I'm not seeing any questions come through. I appreciate that update. We have just a little bit more for you to share, and then we can take any live questions or any questions that come through as I'm talking. I encourage you, if anything comes up, please just go ahead and put in that Q&A feature. But just to give you a shot of what's next, we've mentioned a few times The session summary report will be released in early April, so please do watch for that and watch for city action items within that report. We also, as we wrapped up 2026, actually, as we were wrapping up the legislative session, we already began our policy committee process. So we are currently working on priorities for the 2027-28 biennium for LOC. I know I've seen some policy committee members on and asking questions. We're so grateful to the city staff and elected officials that dedicate their time to supporting staff creating those recommendations for ultimate membership and board approval. So that is happening now within policy committees. Also, what's happening now is revisions and feedback related to the Oregon municipal policy. The president's regional meetings this year are focused on the Oregon municipal policy. We'll be asking our policy committees to engage on this in the late spring and early summer. And there will be a all-member survey coming out. So if you haven't read the Oregon municipal policy recently, I do encourage you to go take a look. It was last updated in 2008. So we're eager to get it updated and add a bit more to it that helps it define LOC's process and how we engage with our members. So at any point, you're welcome to share feedback on that and look forward to hearing that. And then lastly from me, just want to make sure you're tracking that registration for LOC Spring Conference is now open. That conference is taking place in Pendleton this year from April 23rd to 24th. Early bird registration is open now. And I believe I have a typo there on the date registration is open till, so I'll get that fixed before we update this. But we hope to see you at the spring conference, and just much appreciation for joining, for all of the ways you engage this legislative session. We often hear from members, well, don't have your cities call me, and we know we get that feedback because you do call them and you do reach out. So with that, I thank you for your time this afternoon. We're happy to take any additional questions. All right, I'm not seeing any come through, so I will go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you again for joining us in our 2026 legislative update series. And we certainly look forward to seeing you again in 2027, and I'm sure before then.